Hi, happy Tuesday. I'm Dr. Tanya Altman here with Tuesday's tips to keep your family healthy and safe. So, as you know, I come to you every week with my show covering all sorts of different topics from regular child development to illness and disease to most importantly, right now, COVID-19. I'm getting so many questions and messages and requests to cover more topics on COVID. So for those of you who want to hear about something else, please leave it below, as this doesn't have to all be related to COVID-19 every Tuesday. But today I was specifically asked to answer the question, how do I know if my child needs to be tested? And I know many of you might be thinking, well, this is all we hear about now, and we know when we need to test our kids. But there are some little nuances, especially as some kids are getting back to activities, whether it's school or sports or camps. So let's lay it all out for you today. When do you need to test your kids? What test is best? And how do you know when you need to isolate or quarantine at home? Or how do you know when a negative test is truly negative? And that means you can go back to usual activities. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm Dr. Tanya Altman again, pediatrician, and here to help you keep your family healthy and safe. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please do, and please share this and tell your friends. I am here for all of you to answer all of your questions. So many parents have been asking, when do we need to get our kids tested? So this is when you actually do need to get your child tested. Now, many schools, camps, sports associations are requiring testing prior to beginning. So it's important to know that although this test is only a snapshot in time, that one day, and you could still be exposed an hour after you get tested or even the next day, it still can be important in creating a safe environment because it can help us determine the baseline rate in our school, community, or organization. And that's important to know, can we open? It also can help us flag those people that do test positive, whether it was from a past case, maybe a week or two or a month ago, because we know that sometimes that happens. You can still detect virus in your nose, or people who are asymptomatic. And then we can say, hey, you need to isolate at home because you tested positive, whether or not you're symptomatic, for 10 days, and then you're done. And then you can come to the activity that we have planned. Now, current CDC guidelines say that if you test positive, you do not need to be tested again for 3 months. Now, why is this? It's because we feel that there's probably some antibody protection for around 3 months. Now, it's not going to be with everybody. Some are going to be less, some are going to be longer, some may not have any protection. But in general, those are currently the guidelines, which I think coming out soon will be rolled back a little bit. But I do agree that within a month or two of a positive test, there is no reason to retest anyone because they could have a false positive test. And really, they most likely should not be able to catch COVID-19 again that close in time. They can get it again in the future, but they should be good for about a month or two. So again, every organization and school can have their own guidelines when it comes to this. So after that first test, and everybody starts off negative, now, what are other situations and scenarios where you need to test your kids? Well, what if you've been exposed? What if you find out that somebody in your pod or your soccer group or your class has tested positive? When should you ideally get your child tested? Well, the most important thing you should do if your child or your family has been exposed, which means they have been within 6 feet of somebody, whether or not they were wearing a mask or not, for 15 minutes or longer, within 48 hours of that person being diagnosed or testing positive, you need to quarantine at home for 14 days. Now, a lot of people are recommending testing as soon as possible, and the CDC just recommended, hey, you don't need to get tested right away. You just need to quarantine at home if you're not symptomatic. So pros and cons to that recommendation. Well, I like testing, I like information, I like data. But testing too soon isn't really going to help anyone. And I've seen a lot of families rushing to an urgent care 12 hours after their child has been exposed and testing everybody at the party, everybody in the class, everybody on the soccer team. They're all negative, and then they're told by the urgent care, hey, you guys are fine. You can go back to activities tomorrow. You don't have COVID-19. That is false. That is too early to test, and there is no way to say for sure that your child or your group does not have COVID-19. All it tells you is that COVID-19 was not detected today. Now, if it's a PCR or molecular test, that can be much more accurate. Usually that will let you know if you are within a few days of coming down with the virus, if it is brewing in your body, within a few days. But still, testing on day one is often too early. Now, where testing on day one is helpful is when you're in a group setting like a classroom. If somebody in a class gets sick or tests positive, and your kids have been around them for a few days to a week or even longer, then testing on day one could be useful for the entire class to then be able to say, hey, these kids are also positive. We need to extend our contact tracing. We need to make sure that they isolate at home and that everybody quarantines to stop the further spread. So in those situations, it is useful to test on day one, but not if you're at a party for an hour and you think you were exposed. In that case, I would wait until day 2 or 5 after exposure to test, because that way you'll get a better idea of, do you potentially have COVID-19 or not? You still need to quarantine at home for up to 14 days. And ideally, if your test after exposure is negative on day 2 to 5, and although we're talking about kids today, truthfully, this applies to all ages, I would recommend again testing on day 7 to 10. Now, LA Public Health and many public health all across the country have been very adamant that you cannot test out of a quarantine. There is no number of negative tests that can shorten that duration of quarantine period by 14 days if you've been exposed. That said, there are some schools, there are some communities that are saying if you have a negative test in the first few days and you also have a negative test on day 7 to 10, you most likely are negative, especially if you don't have symptoms. And there is potential that you could return a few days early, maybe on day 10. But again, this depends on the guidelines in your community and at your school. And often these guidelines are set by the test positivity rate in your community or the prevalence of COVID-19 in your community. So this cannot apply to everybody. So now let's move on to your child is at school or is in a daycare group, childcare group, pod, or on a sports team. And although they're following all of the recommended protocols, masking, distancing, hand washing, which should decrease transmission, because you're actually assuming that everybody is positive when you use all these universal protection and layers of protection. But still, if somebody comes down with any symptoms, let's say your child has a runny nose, a cough, or a fever, we have to assume that is COVID-19 until proven otherwise or until 10 days of isolation are up. So unfortunately, that means any little sniffles, your child does need to be at home isolating for 10 days, and you should get tested right away. Now, if that test is positive, you need to inform anyone that your child has been in close contact with, again, in the last 48 hours for more than 15 minutes within 6 feet. Let them know so that way they can stay home in quarantine and follow the recommended testing protocols for their children. For your child who has the sniffles, that means testing as soon as possible is a good idea. Always talk to your own pediatrician. They should be testing your child, or they should be directing you to testing in your area that is both accurate and has a quick turnaround time. Because that way you're going to know for sure if your child tests positive that they do have COVID-19, and it is important to contact trace right away. Now, let's say your child tests negative. Well, you really still need to stay home for 10 days. And again, this is when that second test on days 7 to 10 really is important, because if that second test is positive, then again, we need to contact trace. Now, if the second test is negative, if there is an alternative diagnosis, if your pediatrician says You know what? Your child has RSV. Your child has flu. Your child has strep throat. It doesn't for sure mean that your child doesn't have COVID-19 because kids can get two illnesses, two infections at the same time. But in many cases, your pediatrician may be able to say, this child has strep throat and has been treated. This child has an alternative diagnosis, and therefore, with one COVID-19 negative test since their symptoms appeared, and with 72 hours fever-free and symptoms decreasing, and in some areas around the country, it may even be 24 hours fever-free and symptoms decreasing, they can return to school and activities sooner. Now, again, this is going to depend on the area of the country in which you live and what your current school and activity protocols are. Now, personally, I feel that right now, going into fall and winter with COVID-19, 24 hours is not enough, and that extending to 72 hours is still much safer to help decrease transmission throughout kids in group settings. But again, this is a conversation that you need to have with your own pediatrician and your own child's caregiver or school or association or organization that is providing that child care or sports activity or camp for your child. So I hope that answers all of those questions on when your child needs to be tested. So you should be tested if you've been exposed. You should be tested if you've had symptoms. You should be tested if your community says, hey, we need to know the baseline rate here, or we want to regularly do surveillance testing to ensure that no cases are slipping into our community with asymptomatic disease. That's what I recommend, and that's what I am following. And as always, talk to your own pediatrician for health questions. If you have any other questions for me, please leave them here. I will answer them. Also, let me know what you'd like me to talk about next Tuesday. It could be COVID related or not COVID related. I am here for all of your questions and any topics that you'd like me to cover. I'm a pediatrician on the front lines treating COVID-19. I'm also a school physician, and I'm a mom of 3. Until next week, stay safe and healthy.